weeks, have you heard me say that something's one of my favorites, okay? That song is truly one of my favorites. And also there's another one that was written back in 2014 by a couple, Jacob Soder and Maya Fields. It's called Spirit of the Living God, and we sang it a few weeks ago. And there's a part of that song that just speaks to my heart every time I sing it or hear it. Here are the words. They say, Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we want to know you more and more. We're hanging on every word. Because when you speak and when you move, when you do what only you can do, it changes us. It changes what we see and what we seek. When you come into the room, when you do what only you can do, it changes us. It changes what we see and what we seek. You're changing everything. I think what's so great about this song is it talks about how God is moving and how God is doing things that only He can do. And then it talks about how our job, our absolute need, is to follow Him. So today we're wrapping up our series of messages on South Fork's new vision statement, and it's a statement that the elders prayed about and wrestled with God about for about 3 months, okay, to try to get the wording where we felt God wanted it to be. I hope by now, if nothing else, you recognize it, okay, if you don't already know it. So let's look at it again one more time. It says, South Fork Church will be a growing, loving community where biblically relevant truth is lived with each generation, unleashing a new movement by God. For the last 3 weeks, we've been unpacking this statement and what I hope has been some bite-sized nuggets that you've been able to chew on for a while, as well as provide at least part of the biblical foundation for each of the parts of this statement. And we've seen that there's parts of this quote-unquote new statement that this church already is. I think South Fork has been a place where biblical truth has been the anchor ever since the church began in 1832. But there are parts, I think, that we've struggled with, such as sharing the truth with each generation. I don't think any of us could look around and say that we're not lacking certain generations that we're sensing God really wants us to make sure are a part of our future. And in order for that to happen, we need to be led by God, and for Him to do what only He can do, and for us being what He wants us to be. You've heard me say many times during this series, a vision statement is about being, not doing. I was challenged at this week's leadership team meeting to explain the difference between being and doing. And we all know that there are things we should and shouldn't do. The hard part is focusing on what we need to be. You can ask anybody that was at the meeting. I didn't do a very good job of explaining the difference, so I've been wrestling with that all week. And it began to make a little more sense. It came a little more a little more clarity in my mind about how it all fits together when I focused on this last phrase of our vision statement, talking about unleashing a new movement by God. Turn with me this morning to Luke's Gospel. He records for us an interaction between Jesus and two of his very close friends by the name of Mary and Martha. Okay, it's found in Luke chapter 10. I'm going to be reading New Living Translation today. I just kind of got stuck on New Living Translation for this series, and I like the ESV and I like New Living, so it's probably going to be the two main translations that I'm going to be sticking with. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell Tell her to come and help me. And I think she probably said it that way. But Jesus said to her, my dear Martha, you are worried and upset over all these details! Exclamation mark. Did you see that? There's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her. Oh, gosh, we know the story, don't we? About Mary and Martha. Martha was the doer, and Mary was the beer. Martha was overwhelmed by all the things that she needed to do for this dinner party that she was hosting for Jesus and the disciples. She wanted it to be a very good experience for them. But her sister just chose to sit at Jesus' feet and not help her. And that didn't make Martha very happy, did it? Martha doesn't ask Jesus to have Mary help him or help her. She tells him what to do, doesn't she? She's such a doer. She's telling Jesus what to do when she said, tell her to come help me. I think Jesus captures the essence of being instead of doing in this statement, okay? Let's dwell on this statement for a little bit. He says, only one thing worth being concerned about, and Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken from her. Could it be that if we determine what this it is, that we'll begin to understand what it means to be? I think the it was Mary was in the presence of Jesus. Now, you can focus on the phrase that Luke says she was listening to what he taught, but she'd heard what he taught before. There would be other times when she could hear in a crowd of people what Jesus had to say to her. But in this particular situation, there was intimacy. There was a connection. Mary was with Jesus. She was where she needed to be. See, when we're in the presence of God, we are what He wants us to be. Notice I didn't say where He wants us to be, but what He wants us to be. And I get this idea from John chapter 15 when John records for us words of Jesus when he's talking about the vine and the branches. Turn back with me to John chapter 15. New Living Translation says, abide in me, and I in you. This is Jesus talking. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I'm the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Think about it. What can a branch do all by itself if it's not close to or with the vine? We can't produce the vine ourselves and say, okay, I'm going to connect myself as a branch to this vine. It just happens that we become the branch because of our proximity and our closeness and our being with the vine. God wants us to be in His presence, to be in His presence. Some might say, well, Dave, God's everywhere. So anything we do and everything we do, we're going to be in the presence of God. But you know what? I think if we really stopped and thought about that for a while, what we do doesn't reflect us being in the presence of God. For instance, if we stopped and thought about the fact that we were in the presence of God, would we say some of the things that we say? Would we do some of the things that we do? Adam and Eve were created for what? To be in the presence of God. But after that truth was taken from them, what did they do? They hid from God. They no longer wanted to be with God. Being in God's presence and simply being willing to enjoy those moments of situational awareness that he gives to us, I think is where he wants us to be. And once we're there, what we're going to be able to sense is we're going to be able to sense what God's doing. And then we're going to be able to join him and become a part of what I'm going to refer to as a new movement that God is doing, not us. We won't be standing on the sidelines individually or as a church just watching what God's doing. We're going to be a part of what God's doing. The key, if you haven't picked on it by now, is that we need to be with him. The mistake we often make is we make plans. We do what we think we want to do, and then we ask God to bless us or to join us. And what we find, I don't know about you, but what I find is so many times God does things differently than I do. An example could be in how he fulfilled his promise to Abraham that we looked at last week from Genesis chapter 13. Remember the promise? It was the one where decades, his descendants would become a great nation. They would have a land to call their own. And from Abraham's descendants would come a blessing for all generations who's ever lived on the face of the earth. Now, if we were planning on how to fulfill that promise, okay, that God made to Abraham, my guess is that we would have done things a little differently than God. Let's just take, for example, how God led Abraham's descendants into what we now call the Promised Land, okay? On this picture that's on the slides, you can see what we refer to today as really the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and really the whole part of, Iraq, Turkey, all that area there. It's really a small piece. It looks big here, but it's a very, very small piece on the big globe. After God had called Abraham, he led his family from Ur, which is way off to the other side, and they settled in that area that's called Canaan. But they didn't own the land by then. They didn't possess it. In fact, they were living with people who actually were there before them. So God's plan was this. Abraham's great-grandson by the name of Joseph would be sold by his brothers while living in Canaan, and he would go down to Egypt. Okay, can you see Egypt on that slide? And when Canaan experienced this famine, Joseph would be in a position where Abraham's family would come down out of Canaan to Egypt and ask for help. And Joseph was there to be able to help them. Here's what's interesting. In Genesis chapter 39, okay, we're told that Joseph lived in God's presence. It says God was with him. That means that Joseph was in God's presence. And he was there so that he could be a part of what God was doing. You see, he was where God wanted him to be. Ends up, Joseph's family stays in Egypt a lot longer than they had probably originally planned, and a lot longer than Pharaoh planned, because they started growing and multiplying to the point where they became a problem to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has to enslave them and make the Israelites become his servants. But God was still moving. And he was moving in the way that he wanted things to go. We know it was Moses who was the one that God led, who led God's people out of slavery. But once again, it was God who was moving, and he took them in a way that we probably wouldn't have expected. You see, the direction that God moved his people during the Exodus was really a different route than any of our GPSs would have taken us, okay, unless you've got a really messed up GPS. Take a look at this map. It shows how there is a highway, if you can see it, that kind of runs across the top there between Egypt and Canaan. It kind of hugs the Mediterranean Sea. That would have been the easiest, most perfect route for them to follow. But God, instead, leads them into the wilderness, which is the orange line that's on that screen. And he tells us why he did this, okay? He's moving, he's leading them. He tells us why in Exodus chapter 13, verse 17. He says this, when the Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that would have been the shortest route to the promised land. God said, If the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. From the Red Sea, they ended up at Mount Sinai, which is on the bottom there that you saw on that orange line. And it was from there, as long as they stayed in his presence, that they would be able to go to the promised land, which is shown on this slide. What a roundabout way to get to where they were going. But they were in the presence of God. They were where he wanted them to be. How do I know that? Look with me at verse 21 and 22 of Exodus 13. It says, the Lord went ahead of them during this time. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night, and the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. Think about this for a moment. What did the cloud and the fire really do for the Israelites? Well, it showed them where to go in the dark. If it was, the fire, the cloud showed them where to go. I think more than that, what it let them know was they were in the presence. God made sure that they were a part of his next movement. Can you begin to see the connection to us being in the presence of God and being something instead of simply doing something to cause this movement? When we're in God's presence, us to do whatever we want because he's the one who's telling us what to do. That's why I think it's important when we talk about understanding what we need to be and not just about what we do, because the church that God wants us to be is one that's in his presence. If we're in his presence, we're going to do his mission. We know the Great Commission. We know that we're going to make disciples. We know we're going to do that, but we're not going to do that unless we are with him and we are being with him. When the elders included the word new in our vision statement in talking about this movement, it wasn't because we felt God was going to react to something that we were going to do. We didn't think that at all. What we felt was that what we were going to be able to do, what was going to happen is that if we wanted us to be, we could sense what he was doing. And we would be able to follow him and to do what he's called us to do. You see, he's done this many times in history. Between the 1st and the 16th century AD, it was the Catholic Church that had become a major political power, and its focus had really slipped away from being what God and Jesus had called the church to be. They were more of a controlling influence in the political world. Not to mention they were capitalizing on spiritual things like according God's grace to people whenever they sinned by charging them money. For years, people could see how the church was moving in one direction, but God was moving in another direction. And it really wasn't until a German theologian by the name of Martin Luther in 1517 posted 95 statements or reasons or theses, is what they're called, of things that the church needed to be and things that needed to change. And it was after that that it began to be what God wanted it to be again. Luther was instrumental in leading what we describe as the Reformation movement. The Reformation movement's purpose was to reform the Catholic Church back to relying on God's truth and not on opinions that were primarily papal opinions, those of the Pope. Needless to say, there's a lot of resistance from the church when that happened. But you know what? It must have been where God was moving, because look at what's happened. We, along with hundreds of thousands of other Protestant churches, came about because of the Reformation movement. God was moving, and men started seeing, and women started seeing, he's going that direction, and I want to be with him. Problem was, after a while, those churches started having problems, and divisions were taking place. So another example, I think, has roots of another movement of God has some of its roots not too far from here in a state called Kentucky, believe it or not. There are some good things that have come out of Kentucky. Anybody here from Kentucky? Okay, good. In the very early 1800s, there was a lot of division within those Protestant churches that had come out of the Reformation movement. Denominations had popped up all over the place. Divisions taking place in all of those denominations. And I don't think it's a stretch. Men like Alexander Campbell, his son Thomas, a guy named Barton W. Stone, and a few others felt God was moving away from what was going on in the church. Because the churches had all of these man-made creeds and doctrines, and they weren't always in line with what Scripture taught. And so these men said, you know what? God's moving back to Scripture. Moving back to where we're not concerned about what men think, but what the Bible says. So they began what we call the Restoration Movement, whose purpose was to restore the church's faith back to the Scriptures and not rely on just men's interpretations of it. Sometimes, you know what, if you look up the Restoration Movement, you might find a better description of it as the Stone Campbell movement, because those were the two families who were instrumental in leading this movement of God in churches. And from that movement, there came the churches of Christ, the disciples of Christ, and the Christian churches, of which we are a part of that group. It happened in a place called Cane Ridge, Kentucky. If you want to do some interesting reading, do some digging about some of the things that happened at the Cane Ridge revival back in 1801. It's a pretty extreme experience from what happens in Christian churches today. There's a lot more supernatural manifestations of the Holy Spirit at Cane Ridge than there is in our churches today, I tell you that. Which might, in my mind, suggest that God is moving, and perhaps the charismatic movement has some foundation to it. There's been many movements of God in the history of the church. And many times it's men and women who gets credited for what happens, but in reality it's God who's already moving in the direction that he knows that things need to go, and these people are just with him. And because they are with him, they will go and follow him. They are the branches attached to a vine. And it's not what they do, it's who they are that allows them to be a part of what God's doing. When we talk about a movement, we can always talk about movements move forward, and sometimes there is backward movement. I'm going to suggest that God is always moving forward. God's always moving in the direction that he knows is best and that's next. He knew in the case of the Israelites, had they headed straight to the promised land out of Egypt, they would have ran back to Egypt with their tail between their legs, crying the first time they encountered any opposition. God knew, okay? God knew to take them down on that detour and that roundabout. He knew it would take 40 years for them to be with him. God's always moving forward. I think all of us like living in the past because we know it the best. To live in the unknown, the future requires a lot more faith, which, by the way, is going to be the next series we're going to be talking about here for a little while, about what kind of faith does it take to be in a position where when God moves, we're with him and we can go with him. One of the things this new vision statement has caused me to do is to really shift my thinking forward for this church. You know, with 190 years of history to reflect on, God has done some great things here. There's no question about that. And many of those things we should remember, I think, and have celebrated. But here's my fear. What if God's moved on? What if he's not living in our past? But what if he's out there someplace and he's moving and we're still living back here? I want to be with God. I want to be where he's going. I want to be a part of where he's moving. Ever since we revealed the vision statement, people have been asking, well, what's next? And oftentimes they may even say, well, what do we do next? My hope is that from this story of Mary and Martha and Jesus' teaching on the vine and the branches, we can see that our focus needs to be on being with God. Most of us are just not comfortable not doing things. We got to be doing something all the time. Maybe it's reading or watching a tablet or watching TV or fiddling with something with our hands. What if? What if we were just okay wandering in the wilderness with God, being in his presence for a while? Not doing anything in particular. Just making sure that we see God and that we're in his presence. The major advantage that the Israelites had over us, they knew they were in God's presence because there was this cloud or there's this pillar of fire at night. We're probably going to have to be more discerning to figure out exactly what God's doing and where he's moving. But you know what? He's not going to hide himself from calling us to be with him. The challenge is for us to be okay with just being a branch, attached to the vine, and growing each day. If you think about it, branches can't do much if they're not attached to a vine. This is what Jesus said about this. Back to John chapter 15, verse 6. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, am I stretching it too much to say that's what it means to be with God? That's what he's talking about here. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want, and it will be granted. Oh, man. I hope we remain with God. Is that we are a part of his new movement. Whatever that is. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your presence. We feel it. We sense it. We know from your word that you are here with us. And so, God, I'm comfortable with it. That presence brings about a peace that produces a faith that gives us eyes to see what you're doing. God, you've done something in this community. I know that you've done something during the pandemic after the pandemic, God, you're moving. You're not just sitting around. You're not living in the past about what life. You were thinking about what's in the future. We want to think that way too. Just be in your presence. The rest of today, this week, next week. Father, when we worship here next week, I pray that there would just be an awareness in all of our lives that we're here with you, and that's going to change us because, God, when you come into the room, it changes what we see and what we seek. God, help us to be with you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.